predicting the next pandemic. Kobo Steenkamp's sprawling farm is in South Africa's Central Plains, where the sky makes everything seem small. Steenkamp woke up here one morning after the rains in 2010 to find something strange happening with his sheep. All his pregnant ewes were losing their lambs. It was every farmer's nightmare. His herd had been infected by Rift Valley fever, a mosquito-borne virus that causes abortion and death in livestock and wildlife and can be transmitted to humans. Within days, dozens of people had also been infected. Most displayed only flu-like symptoms, but in some cases, the illness escalated into a severe hemorrhagic fever akin to Ebola. A similar scene was unfolding across the region. The survival rate in adult animals is as low as 10%, and nearly 100% of infected sheep abort their pregnancies. By the time the outbreak was under control, almost 9,000 animals and 25 people had died. Neighboring countries banned South African meat, shattering the livestock industry. Ever since the virus was first identified in 1931 in Kenya's Rift Valley, outbreaks like this had been confined to southern and eastern Africa. But in 1977, the disease migrated north through increased trade on the Nile River, causing what the World Health Organization, or WHO, called an explosive outbreak in Egypt. Then, in September of 2000, it jumped to the Arabian Peninsula, arriving in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, sparking anxiety that Europe and North America were next. The idea that the virus could spread across these continents in just a few years is not an exaggeration. Rift is transmitted through a broader range of hosts than West Nile virus, which arrived in New York City in 1999 and spread across the U.S. in less than 6 years. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has taken notice, naming Rift the third most dangerous animal pathogen, behind only bird flu and foot and mouth disease. But health officials are not just worried about its impact on animals and agriculture. Zoonotic diseases, infectious illnesses that begin in animal populations and jump to humans, such as Rift and the novel coronavirus that caused the 2020 global pandemic, are major concerns. And for good reason. They have been responsible for some of history's worst epidemics and pandemics, including bubonic plague and Ebola. The fear that Rift could grow into a global pandemic highlights that public health researchers still don't know how to effectively predict disease outbreaks, which have devastating consequences on health, economies, and political stability. Meanwhile, the threat of emerging zoonotic diseases is expanding, and often in unforeseen ways. Scientists are only beginning to understand how outbreaks correlate with shifting weather patterns, a hallmark of climate change. Worldwide, temperatures are changing faster than anyone previously predicted, and as a result, habitats are too, altering the ranges of animals, viruses, and, increasingly, humans. These complex relationships are now more volatile than ever, leading one recent paper in the journal Lancet to conclude that climate change is the biggest global health threat in the 21st century, and another to suggest that it threatens to undermine the last half-century of gains in development and global health. Global warming and extreme weather patterns are already dramatic forces on public health. Intensified floods, droughts, and storms are changing how humans can use land and ultimately where we can live. As climatologists race to model these changes, epidemiologists are realizing how critical it is to develop epidemic prediction tools that incorporate new and impending weather patterns. In an ever more globalized world, this may be the way to prevent a future of unprecedented pandemics. Places like Steenkamp's farm are where the last of several rift epidemics in South Africa began. It's here, in an area larger than the size of Maryland, that biologist Etienne Theron and dozens more researchers like him are collecting and analyzing data for a project run by EcoHealth Alliance, a global nonprofit that focuses on pandemic prevention. The challenge for scientists and policymakers alike is to learn how to intervene before pathogens infect people. As EcoHealth President Peter Daszak said in 2015, once a pandemic emerges, all you can really do is put out the fire. The goal of this multidisciplinary project is to examine for the first time exactly how climate affects Rift Valley fever in South Africa. From this, researchers hope to develop a data-based model that actually predicts outbreaks before they happen, a stepping stone to making models for other viruses as well. Notably, the U.S. Department of Defense has funded the entire project. Keeping diseases from reaching the U.S.'s shores and knowing how to react if they do is increasingly a matter of national security. Using a random distribution of GPS points, Theron and his team of researchers have reached an agreement with 361 isolated farms like Steenkamp's. For 2 years in a row, they have taken blood samples from livestock and farm staff to test for Rift antibodies, trying to understand where the virus might be lurking when no one is reporting active cases. Steenkamp himself was infected during an outbreak in the 1970s, and according to the WHO, as many as 10,000 people a year contract the virus. That number will most likely rise. A 2016 study published in Emerging Microbes and Infections reports that the explosive nature of recent epidemics suggests Rift has mutated into a more infectious and severe strain. As it migrates to new places, the virus may evolve further, becoming even more dangerous. In South Africa, a particular type of mosquito is thought to be the main carrier of Rift. The female mosquito transmits the virus directly to their offspring, and the eggs can survive years of drought, a typical occurrence in this region. When the new generation of infected mosquitoes eventually hatch, they transmit the virus to livestock and wildlife alike. The virus amplifies in these hosts, so that when wider-ranging kinds of mosquitoes bite infected animals, the original outbreak transforms into a swift-moving epidemic. Field Coordinator Claudia Cordell explains that though the basics of the virus transmission are known, we have no idea how wildlife impacts people or livestock, or vice versa. That's why the EcoHealth team wants to get a more granular look at the interactions of weather, plants, insects, animals, and people. This kind of comprehensive approach, which required dozens of experts in epidemiology, ecology, climatology, veterinary medicine, and entomology, is both costly and relatively rare. But it may be the future of understanding how infectious diseases emerge and spread. It makes sense that the health of an animal population is related to the health of the human population, says Melinda Rostel, one of the project's investigators. Animals often serve as early warning signs of a new outbreak. In 2017, for example, local monkey populations in Brazil were nearly wiped out 8 months before a yellow fever epidemic. But structuring research around interactions among people, animals, and the environment has only recently gained traction in the global health community. This strategy, first defined by epidemiologist Calvin Schwabe in 1964, and now called One Health, is an increasingly popular intellectual framework for epidemiology. Still, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention did not establish a One Health office until 2009, when officials acknowledged that changing environmental interactions have led to the emergence and re-emergence of many diseases. In South Africa, satellite data from NASA suggests that the region will see altered weather patterns, changing its risk of both Rift and other infectious diseases. Transmission is a complicated thing, but undoubtedly a key factor in future disease control will be understanding the implications of our changing climate. In March 2018, South Africa declared a national state of disaster over its prolonged drought, and Cape Town was at risk of running out of water during its worst drought in 400 years. Drought itself is a standard feature of El Niño weather patterns, and when La Niña eventually comes and completes the cycle, the area will see heavy rains. But these cycles, while typical, are intensifying because of climate change, explains Asif Anyamba, a research scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Even as conditions grow more extreme, the downpour associated with this rain pattern and the vegetation that downpour creates are what makes it possible to predict the hatching of rift-infected mosquitoes. In fact, Anyamba was able to successfully predict the 2006 and 2007 rift outbreak by adding satellite climate models to the mix instead of just relying on regional weather patterns. With that promising model in hand, Anyamba looked to southern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. If he could apply the tools he used in eastern Africa to predict rift outbreaks elsewhere, perhaps he could expand the model to other diseases. But so far, the rift models have failed in South Africa. As the climate expert on the EcoHealth study, Anyamba is trying to figure out why. Satellite data that show and forecast global weather patterns make it easier to predict changes with vegetation and insects. But this big picture view is fairly imprecise. Mosquitoes tend to live in an area the size of a suburban backyard, so many models do not get at the scale with which pathogens interact with their hosts. Although weather has long been linked with disease, think flu season, customized models are needed to predict outbreaks. A one-size-fits-all template will not work. Anyamba's new tactic is to use information gathered by the EcoHealth team on mosquitoes and vegetation in South Africa to build such fine-grained models. Climate change may eventually make the area drier, which would help prevent rift outbreaks. But other parts of the country will likely get warmer and wetter, increasing rift and the other diseases that floods tend to foster. Learning how to develop more regionally sensitive models will help scientists understand how the impact of disease may change, both locally and globally. Getting there is a matter of urgency. While it is rare to find sweeping conclusions in epidemiology, it is clear that greater climate variability and therefore greater disease fluctuation is already here. Mosquito and other insect habitats have expanded because of warming, exposing new populations to viruses. Preliminary research shows that malaria, for example, is globally on the rise. A temperature bump of just 2 degrees Celsius, a mark we are quickly approaching, would expand the number of people at risk of malaria by several hundred million, according to the WHO. Strangely, places that are now ideal climates for malaria may see less of it as they warm. Prevalence will likely occur where malaria hasn't yet arrived, such as the US. Or take blue tongue virus, a highly lethal ruminant disease that is spread by biting flies called culicoides. Historically, it was confined to tropical regions, but by 2006, there was enough warming in Western Europe that some of those flies moved north and infected animals. Scientists were surprised when another kind of fly then picked up the virus from sickened sheep and carried it all the way to Norway. Corey Brown, a veterinary pathologist at the University of Georgia, says blue tongue is a prime example of how climate change introduces species to one another for the first time, expanding how diseases can spread in an unpredictable manner. Experts disagree on the best way to handle these risks. The U.S. Agency for International Development supports a strategy that focuses on identifying new pathogens. But Brown thinks merely discovering new viruses is an inefficient use of limited research funding. Instead, Brown and others who advocate for a One Health approach think strengthening local infrastructure, building monitoring systems and training community nurses, for instance, is the most effective way to grapple with the burdens of emerging diseases. Local detection systems are especially important in places where humans are the ones who have moved into new environments, exposing themselves to diseases they haven't yet encountered. In an unchanging world, you don't see a lot of emerging disease, says William Koresh, an epidemiologist and the Rift Studies principal investigator. It's when systems alter that microbes reveal themselves in new ways. In a 2012 paper published in The Lancet, Koresh and his colleagues summarized these findings by explaining that many zoonoses can be linked to large-scale changes in land use. That is certainly true in South Africa. The thousands of blood samples EcoHealth has collected ended up in a biosafety level 4 laboratory in Johannesburg. Like Ebola, work with Rift is only allowed in the highest level of containment, and investigator Janusz Paweszka wears a pressurized protective suit to examine Rift specimens under a microscope. As head of South Africa's Center for Emerging Zoonotic and Parasitic Diseases, he does not mince words. Who creates this environment for emergence? You can't accuse nature. Uncontrolled urbanization, climate change, poverty, that's not nature. The answer is that we create the situation for the emergence of many of these diseases. Arguably, poverty is already the greatest risk factor for getting sick. The major trigger or determinant of health is economic, says Antoine Flahault, director of the Institute of Global Health in Geneva, explaining that an unequal distribution of healthcare is the primary problem. The WHO estimates that in low-income countries, 45% of deaths come from diseases that are often preventable or treatable, like diarrhea, malnutrition, and parasitic infections. Climate change is expected to drive at least 122 million people into extreme poverty in the next few decades, forcing many to leave their homes and leading to rapid urbanization, all of which tends to foster disease. Flahault expects that one of the major disease contributions of climate change will come from these consequences of forced migration. But when countries with limited resources are asked to prepare for a future potential threat, often at the cost of immediate problems, it's a hard trade-off, explains Susan Scribner, director of the Preparedness and Response Project at the global development firm DAI. What we do is called health, but in some ways, a lot of it has to do with good governance, she says. That is why projects such as the RIFT study could be particularly powerful. They provide data to many different stakeholders, spanning agriculture, health, and defense. Anyamba, EcoHealth's climate expert, sees the RIFT study as the way of the future. I envision more projects involving climate data, fused with advanced analytics and machine learning technologies that will begin to answer some questions about why particular disease outbreaks occur, he says. Policymakers may be juggling other priorities, but it is important that they understand this science, Scribner says, because when a pandemic hits, scientists aren't the ones in charge of the response. In fact, the DoD's Defense Threat Reduction Agency funded similarly comprehensive research to predict and map areas at risk for chikungunya, another mosquito-borne viral infection. There is a long list of diseases, such as yellow fever, dengue, and even rabies, that would benefit from the kinds of resources the DoD can bring to bear. But funding and the politics that go into deciding whose research gets it plays a critical role in which diseases are deemed worthy of attention. Just as we are beginning to realize how urgent a collaborative approach to disease might be, many forces may conspire to prevent such endeavors, damaging global health, economic growth, and weakening international stability. The world is quickly changing, even if we do not yet know the consequences. This video was adapted from the article Catching Fever by freelance journalist Lois Parshley. It appeared in the Climate Change Special Collectors issue of Scientific American.